Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. This morning we're going to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The History of Romanism by John Dowling. We're currently reading about the research done by Dr. Middleton, a British divine, they call him. And he has gone to Rome to study Roman antiquity. Ancient Rome, pagan Rome. And what he has discovered is that what we find in the Roman Catholic Church under the Holy Roman Empire after the Caesars were taken out of the way, we find that self-same heathenism. That Roman Catholicism has its roots, whole and entire, in the ancient pagan religions of old pagan Rome. Nothing has changed. And this is an astonishing revelation to those who are not familiar with it. Those who, in our day and age, who think that Roman Catholicism is just another denomination of Christianity, the facts, the irrefutable facts, maintain that there's no such thing as Christianity in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, he concludes his research and his letter from Rome, summing up his researches and his findings. And we'll begin reading in the last line of page 129 in the book, where he makes his conclusion. He says, "I have sufficiently made good what I first undertook to prove, an exact conformity, or rather uniformity, of worship between popery and paganism. For since we see the present people of Rome worshiping in the same temples, at the same altars, sometimes the same images, and always with the same ceremonies as the old Romans, who can absolve them from the same superstition and idolatry of which we condemn their pagan ancestors?" Interesting question, isn't it? He says, since we see the present people of Rome worshiping in the same temples, at the same altars, sometimes the same images, and always with the same ceremonies as the old pagan Romans, who can absolve them from the same superstition and idolatry of which we condemn their pagan ancestors? Now, in no more clear terms can we possibly say that Romanism is paganism. It's not Christianity. And to call it Christianity is to blaspheme the name of Christ. Now, where do we find ourselves today? Not only do we agree that Roman Catholicism is Christianity, but it is the mother church, and that all the harlot daughters must return home to mama. And I can't express in words of anguish what a horrendous situation Christianity is in today. There are no words in my vocabulary sufficient to sum up the degree to which Christianity has been polluted, not only in this country but around the world. To think that those who once protested the papacy as the Antichrist, and I'm not just talking about the Protestant Reformation. I'm going all the way back to the first century Christians who understood precisely what Paul was preaching when he said, "He who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way, and then that man of sin shall be revealed." They knew that he was speaking of the power then and there reigning, which was the ancient pagan Roman Caesars, the ones who crucified Christ along with their Jewish counterparts, the religious leader of the Jews, is the self-same pagan Caesar that would replace him called the Roman Pontiff, the Papacy. And nothing would change, only that he would persecute the saints of the Most High, literally drunk with the bloods of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus, that he would lead the whole world astray, deceiving the whole world. He would be the man of sin, the son of perdition. Now, although the first century Christians didn't know what his title would be, Holy Roman Pontiff, they knew that it would be that power which replaced the Caesars, would be that great wicked that Paul prophesied, and that it would come about because of the great falling away from the faith, the great apostasy. Now, if it took great apostasy to raise up the papacy, what kind of an apostasy would it take to return the Protestant and evangelical churches back under Roman tyranny, back under Roman servitude, back under ecumenical unity with the Roman Catholic Pope? There's never been a time of so great apostasy as there is today. Never in the history of the Christian world has there been a greater apostasy than what we see today and in all the churches, no matter what denomination. That's the only conclusion that can be drawn from all of this. And I just literally have no words in my vocabulary to describe the desperate situation that Christianity is in today. Now he continues with the conclusion of his letter. He said, those who would wish to see this striking parallel between popery and paganism carried out yet further must consult the valuable and masterly work to which I am indebted for most of these interesting particulars, with the full references and original quotations from various authorities, ancient as well as modern, Roman Catholic as well as Protestant. That this policy of conciliating the heathen nations by adopting their pagan ceremonies into Christian worship had been adopted previous to the epoch of papal supremacy AD 606 is abundantly evident from the instructions given by Gregory the Great to Augustine, his missionary in Britain, and to Cyrenus, the Bishop of Marseille in France, both of whom had written to the pontiff for advice. Okay? Here is how Roman Catholicism corrupted Great Britain and France. This is the original interposition of the papacy, the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist gaining authority in the ancient British Isles and in the former Gaul, now known as France. He says, according to Gregory's instructions to Augustine, as related by Bauer, is as follows, quote, not satisfied with directing Augustine not to destroy, but to preserve for the worship of God the profane places where the pagan Saxons had worshipped their idols, Gregory would have him treat the more profane usages, rites, and ceremonies of the pagans in the same manner, that is, not to abolish, but to sanctify them by changing the end for which they were instituted, and induce them, thus sanctified, into the Christian worship. In other words, it was the hope and intent of Gregory, the Pope of Rome, as he instructed his emissary to Britain, Augustine, to literally allow the pagan Saxons to continue every form of their pagan worship, only to sanctify those ancient pagan usages, rites, and rituals and ceremonies and sacrifices, as it were, to the worship of the God of heaven. This is another case proving that Roman Catholicism and religion in Great Britain to be nothing but baptized paganism. He says this he specifies in a particular ceremony, quote, whereas it is a custom, he says, among the Saxons to slay abundance of oxen and sacrifice them to the devil, you must not abolish that custom, but appoint a new festival to be kept either on the day of the consecration of the churches or the birthday of the saints whose relics are deposited there, and on these days the Saxons may be allowed to make arbors round the temples, changed into churches, to kill their oxen and to feast as they did while they were still yet pagans. Only they shall offer their thanks and praises not to the devil, but to God, unquote. Now plainly, you can see that the decree of the Pope is to allow the Saxons to continue in all of their pagan rites and rituals and just dedicate those pagan rites and rituals to the worship of God. He says this advice, absolutely irreconcilable with the purity of the gospel worship, the Pope founds on a pretended impossibility of weaning men at once from their rites and ceremonies to which they have been long accustomed, and on the hopes of bringing the converts in due time by such an indulgence to a better sense of the duty to God. Thus was the religion of the Saxons, our ancestors, so disfigured and corrupted with all the superstitions of paganism at its first being planted among them, that it scarce deserved the name of Christianity, but was rather a mix of Christianity and paganism, or Christianity and paganism molded together, as it were, into a third religion, unquote. So here you have, in plain Christian language, the undeniable assertion that the Roman Catholic Church is not Christianity whatsoever. And that Christianity that is now celebrated in Great Britain has pagan roots, Roman Catholic roots. Okay? There's hardly any Protestantism left in Great Britain to this day, just as there's hardly any Protestantism left in America today. Why? Because when Protestantism was strong in Great Britain and strong in the United States of America, the Jesuits transferred the ancient teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, the teachings called preterism and futurism, and they instituted them as orthodox teaching within the Protestant seminaries of Great Britain, Scotland, and the United States of America. And futurism, together with preterism, exonerates the papacy of the historical recognition as the Antichrist of the Bible, and places all the onus of Antichrist either, in the preterist case, of an ancient pagan Roman Caesar that was the Antichrist and long since done away with, and, as is most believed in this country, in Great Britain today, that the Antichrist is a future individual yet to be determined. And in either case, the papacy is exonerated. And that was how Rome destroyed Protestantism in Great Britain and the United States of America. And this literally opened the door for Vatican Council II. And the ultimatum, now that you've renounced your Protestantism, now that you believe the Antichrist is either an ancient figure of the old pagan Roman Empire, or you believe that the Antichrist of the Bible is some future individual, then your Protestant Reformation was a joke, wasn't it? You had no grounds to protest the legitimate seat of God on earth, the papacy. And because you have rebelled against God's throne on earth, the papacy, and you have done great evil, you will restore the papacy at your own expense, with your own blood, your own guts, your own treasure, your own lives, your own human resources. All of your war-making capabilities will now be directed at not only restoring the papacy to the original power and authority that he had in the world, but to conquer even yet the rest of the world for papal domination. And that's what Great Britain and the United States have been doing ever since. They are nothing but the battle axe for the Pope. All these wars that were instigated on the false flag operation called 9/11 have been directed toward conquering all of the rest of the world over which the papacy never had rule. Since the United States and Great Britain have been totally conquered by the papacy through preterism and futurism, the religious leaders, the political leaders of both countries are now on board with the papal agenda, papal hegemony globally. And we're literally, our governments, both in the United States and England, Great Britain, are making reparations to the papacy. They're not telling us about it, because we're the ones who are paying the bills and shedding the blood and having our blood be shed. But their agenda is to undo and to restore what was lost at the time of the Protestant Reformation, when it was universally understood that the papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist of the Bible. And having been duped by these senseless alternative views of Bible prophecy, preterism and futurism, now the papacy has the upper hand over our governments, and he has assumed his divine right status to rule over the kings of the earth, and he has assembled his kings and their militaries to not only maintain Roman Catholic authority where it already exists, but to extend the papal power all over the rest of the world. And that includes, and particularly, the Muslim world and Israel today. Do you see what a little lie will get you? Believing the lie that Roman Catholicism is Christianity, when we have clearly proven its pagan origin, its pagan intent, it is nothing but Satan's great deception. The great falling away led to the rise of the papacy, and now we're all slaves to him. And as much as you may protest him today, you pay your taxes to help finance the wars, to undo the Protestant Reformation, to extend the papal power where it usually existed in Europe, that became Protestant during the time of the Protestant Reformation, to destroy that Protestantism, to restore papal power in his realms, and not only that, but to extend the papal power all over the world. That's what NATO is all about. That's what the United States is all about. That's what the United Nations is all about. And it's time for us to see our error and correct it. We have literally become slaves to the man of sin, the son of perdition, the Antichrist of the Bible. We have all, each and every one of us, been deceived at some level by this papal power. And now we're all made slaves to him by our own governments. 9/11 was an inside job. It was needed to get the Protestant countries, the formerly Protestant countries, Great Britain and the United States, to go on a global crusade for the Pope, enlisting the help of the other NATO nations, goading them into joining our crusades, and that's what it's all about. And we're paying for it. Our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and for generation after generation after generation are already in insurmountable debt at the expense of Protestantism. We're literally restoring the papal power. God's very elect are restoring the papal power. They're doing it with their own blood and their own guts. They're doing it with their own treasure and the treasure of multitudes of generations into the future who will never see the light of financial day after having paid the debt to the papacy. You're never going to hear this anywhere else. You can deal with GMOs, and you can talk about HARP, and you can talk about the space race and the moonshot and whether the earth is flat or round. You can talk about any subject that is most popular in the so-called truth movement, but you won't find anybody talking about this, because this is where it's at. They'll divert your attention to anything and everything but the truth that the papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist of the Bible, and he has harnessed all the power of this earth to restore him and to elevate him to global supremacy. Now, at what point does GMOs and flat earth and round earth and heliocentricity and geocentricity and all these other cockamamie deals, interests, what do they have in comparison with the truth? Nothing. So you might ask the question, why doesn't Tom ever talk about chemtrails? Why doesn't Tom ever talk about Muslim terrorism? Why doesn't Tom ever talk about, blue beam? It's because they're all fodder to distract you from the one single most important subject known to man today. Who is the Antichrist? Who has deceived God's people? Who has deceived the very elect? Who is it who pretends to be the vicar of God on earth? Who commands the worship of every man, woman, and child on the planet? Who puts as vassals every king, every prince, every potentate, every power, even the throne of Almighty God himself? The papacy. Who is Satan in the flesh? The papacy. And do you know what? If we all come to this Protestant understanding, then maybe there's some hope for true Christianity in this world. He says, thus was the religion of the Saxons, our ancestors, so disfigured and corrupted with all the superstitions of paganism, at its first being planted among them, that it scarce deserved the name of Christianity, but was rather a mixture of Christianity and paganism, mixing the holy with the profane, or Christianity and paganism molded together, as it were, into a third religion. And who would dare call it Christianity? Virtually the entire Christian world. What apostasy! We've talked briefly, maybe not so briefly in your mind, but only briefly, with Rome's influence on ancient Saxony, the Great Britain of today. The papacy corrupted it early on, and it is corrupt today. What's left of the little bit left of the Protestant Reformation in Great Britain is so far outnumbered as to be embarrassing. Okay? The Queen is a vassal of the Pope. Or rather, the Queen is the vassal of the Mayor of London. She doesn't serve Christ. She serves Antichrist. And she does it under the name of Protestantism, of all things. Okay? Now, we've talked about Great Britain. What about France? He says the other instance was as follows, quote, The Franks, who had settled in the south of Gaul, now called France, had been indulged at the time of their conversion in the use of images, and that indulgence had insensibly brought them back to idolatry. For turning the images of Christ into idols, they paid them the same kind of worship or adoration after their conversion which they had paid to their idols before their conversion. Okay? So this is the influence of Roman Catholicism on what might have otherwise been Christianity in France. They reduced the image of the incorruptible God into images made unlike unto man and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. God forever and always forbid the use of images and idols, and Rome reinforced it in France and converted the Christians back into paganism. He says, if I can find my place here, he paid their ancient images the same kind of worship and adoration after their conversion to Christ, which they had paid to their idols before their conversion. This Cyrenus, the bishop of Gaul or France, this Cyrenus could not bear, and therefore to show his abhorrence for such abominations, and at the same time to prevent them in time to come, he caused all the images throughout his diocese to be pulled down and to be cast out of the churches and destroyed. Okay? He followed the example of the ancient righteous king of Israel, who broke down the groves and broke down the images and the idols that the Jews and the Israelites were worshiping. This Cyrenus could not bear the abhorrence and the abomination of idolatry in a Christian church. So he commanded that all those images within his diocese be pulled down and cast out of the churches and destroyed. He says that wise and zealous prelate was, it seems, even then, when the dangerous practice of setting up images was yet in its infancy, apprised of a truth, which all have now learned by the experience of many ages, all at least who care to learn, viz., that images cannot be allowed and idolatry must be prevented. However, this instance of his zeal for the purity of the Christian worship was very ill received at Rome, as one might imagine. The great idol of the world, the Papacy, loves idolatry. And it said, and indeed Gregory acted therein consistently with himself, for having directed Austin this very year to introduce the pagan rites and usages into the church, he could not blame Cyrenus for thus excluding them, and he wrote to him accordingly, commending indeed his zeal in not suffering to be worshipped that which was made by hands, that is, imagery and idolatry, but at the same time blaming him for breaking down their images and idols, quote, to prevent their being worshipped, since they served the ignorant in the room of books and instructed by being seen those who could not read. In other words, out of one side of his mouth, the Pope condemned imagery and idolatry and praised Cyrenus for his zeal, but on the other hand said that now that the images and idols are destroyed, they have no way to learn about Christianity because they can't read books. It was through their images and idols that they were learning about Christianity. Yeah, that's right. You can't be a Christian. If you can't read, you can't be a Christian unless you're studying the images and the idols of the Roman Catholic Church. Now you know why Rome prevented people from learning to read the Bible. Rome doesn't want anybody to be able to learn to read and think for themselves. That way we just are left with nothing else but the books of learning called images and idols. This is the characteristic of the Dark Ages, when ignorance was considered by the Roman priests to be a blessing. They didn't have to contend with people that could actually read, who could actually read the Bible and see that God condemned imagery and idolatry. And if they could read, what they most hated the most was that the people came to the conclusion that the man of sin, the son of perdition, the little horn of Daniel, the Antichrist, is none other than the papacy. So they forbid the reading of the Bible, choosing instead to make idols and images out of Jesus and Mary and all the saints, and to lead those who were once on the path to Christian belief and practice, to lead them right back into idolatry. Satan's man, the Pope. Satan in the flesh, the Pope. The papacy of every generation. Not just a man of sin of the ancient pagan Romans, not just an antichrist in the future, but the whole Christian era has been dominated by this man of sin, this son of perdition, this little horn. And if you believe otherwise, you've been deceived, just as I was for nearly 50 years of my life. Deceived by quote-unquote Christians, deceived by quote-unquote Bible believers, deceived by quote-unquote Protestants and evangelicals. They all believe this nonsense. And the Scripture leaves no room for any of it but condemnation. He says, but the reason on which the Pope seems to have laid his chief stress in censuring the conduct of Cyrenus was that by breaking the images and banishing them from the churches, he would prejudice the barbarians, that is, the Franks, among whom he lived, against the Christian religion. So here you have a definition of a Christian religion. Imagery and idolatry. Nothing's changed but the name. A pagan is just as comfortable in a Roman Catholic church as he was in his old pagan temple, because the same images and idols exist, only now they have Christian names. He continues, he says, so that it was chiefly to gratify the pagans who were converted, to facilitate the conversion of the others, and to adopt the Christian religion to their ideas and notions, to adapt, rather, the Christian religion, that's Roman Catholicism, to their ideas and notions, that the use of images and many other rites of the pagan worship were allowed in the church. But how different was this method of converting the pagans from that which the apostles pursued, and their immediate successors, nay, and all the apostolic men of the first 3 centuries after Christ? With them it was a principle not to sanctify, but to utterly abolish all pagan rites, all superstitious practices, whatever, and introduce in their place a plainness and simplicity suited to the worship of God, in spirit and in truth. Upon that principle, images of no kind were suffered or allowed or tolerated in the church during the first 3 centuries, as is allowed by several Roman Catholic writers. Nay, it was not until the latter end of the 4th century that the pagan temples began to be converted into Christian churches. They had all till then been either shut up or pulled down, the bishops of those times thinking it a great profanation, a profanity, to worship God even in the places where worship had been paid to the devil. Do you realize what this author just plainly told you? That in the ancient pagan world, in the early days before Roman Catholicism got her power and strength and authority, that the pagans were converting to Christianity. They were breaking down all the images and idols. They were closing all the pagan temples. They were breaking them down. Their ruins still exist today. It was a war against idolatry. And what did the Roman Catholic Church do? They stopped the destroying of images and idols and pagan temples and made it Christianity. They restored paganism in the name of Christ. They restored imagery and idolatry in the name of Christ. The progress that was being made in the old pagan world when the gospel was first preached resulted in the destruction of the images, the idols, the temples, the rituals, the celebrations. All of paganism and all of its tenets were crumbling under the weight of the gospel. But Rome propped it all right back up. The Vatican propped it all right back up. Do you still think the man of sin, the son of perdition, the Antichrist is somebody in the future? He said they had all till then been either shut up or pulled down. The bishops of those times thinking it a great profanation to worship God, even in the places where worship had been paid to the devil. He says the above remarkable instances of papal conformity to paganism related upon the unquestionable authority of Gregory's own epistles are a proof that this wicked policy had been thus early adopted, and though it is not perhaps absolutely certain that all the pagan ceremonies above enumerated were introduced into the Romish worship so early as 606 AD, yet without doubt most of them were in use in the time of Boniface and the others not long after. The Pantheon, which is an ancient pagan temple in Rome, dedicated to any and every god. He said the Pantheon, as we have seen, was consecrated to, quote, the Virgin and all the saints. Within 4 or 5 years of the establishment of the papal supremacy. Yes, one of the first acts after the Bishop of Rome gained his universal status, one of the very first acts of the Antichrist of the Bible was to take the ancient pagan temple called the Pantheon and make it a Christian temple, and take the same images and idols that the pagans worshipped within that temple and simply rename them the Virgin and all the saints. He says, on that occasion, Pope Boniface IV employed the newly acquired papal authority in enjoining, that is, forcing upon all the faithful, that is, Christians, the observance of a festival in commemoration of that event, which is still celebrated with great ceremony in all popish countries on the 1st of November, called the Feast of All Saints. Have you ever heard of the Feast of All Saints, All Saints' Day? A feast in the 1st of November of every year. Roman Catholics get together to celebrate the Feast of All Saints' Day. And that day is commemorated by the act of Boniface VIII, Pope Boniface VIII, Antichrist Pope Boniface VIII, consecrating the ancient pagan temple called the Pantheon into a Christian church. Same building, same images, same idols, just dedicated to the worship of Mary and all the saints. That's All Saints' Day. It's a feast of the Roman Catholic Church celebrated all over the world, even in the United States of America, right out in front of God and everybody, and nobody protests. He said image worship, as we shall see, was not finally and fully established till about the middle of the 9th century, after a long contest between different emperors, popes, and councils. You know why there was a long contest between emperors, popes, and councils? So that all of God's people could read in the newspapers and the presses at the time all the means by which information flowed, verbally, by letters, by every means, this great controversy in the Roman Catholic Church over the war over image worship and idol worship in the Roman Catholic Church. You see, God was not going to allow his saints to be ignorant about who the Antichrist was. So there was a great controversy even within the Roman Catholic Church, even in the Holy Roman Empire, from stem to stern, a great controversy over image worship, so that everyone was familiar about the great struggle within the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire about whether or not imagery and idolatry would become a fixture in Christianity. This is so God's saints would not be ignorant of who the Antichrist was, because we know no man of God would even argue the point of imagery and idolatry. They're forbidden. God publicly made a spectacle of the man of sin, the son of perdition, so that no one would think that he had anything whatsoever to do with God Almighty. He said, image worship, as we shall see, was not finally and fully established till about the middle of the 9th century, after a long contest between different emperors, popes, and councils. The history and origin of these pagan innovations upon Christian worship has been given at considerable length, because it is believed that the most satisfactory mode is thereby suggested of answering the question which so frequently presents itself to the candid and inquiring mind when contemplating the heathen mummeries of papal worship. Can it be possible that this is Christianity? That this is the religion of the New Testament? Of Jesus Christ and his apostles? And if it is called by the name, whence did it become so corrupted, so like the religion of pagan Greece and Rome? The answer is no. This is not Christianity. It is paganism under that venerated name. And the transformation was effected by borrowing the temples, the idols, the ceremonies of heathenism to silence the scruples and to win the suffrages of those who had no taste for a religion so pure, so spiritual, and so holy as the religion of Jesus Christ. There you have it. Middleton plainly says, don't you dare call Roman Catholicism Christianity, for to do so is to blaspheme the name of our Christ. Who would say they worship Jesus Christ and then bow down and worship and kiss the slippered toe of the vicar of hell and call it Christianity? Well, that's what all the ecumenical evangelibellies do. Now, people have assailed me for a long time of being so crude in my speech as to insult somebody by calling them an ecumenical evangelibelly. Well, that's not a very Christian thing to do, Tom. Calling names, isn't that kind of childish? No. It's the truth. And it's mild in comparison to what Christ will call them when he returns. And I don't apologize. That concludes Book 2. Now we'll begin Book 3. Continuing our coverage of the rise and advance of the Antichrist power in the world, Book 3 deals with popery advancing from AD 606 to 800 AD. It is subtitled From the Establishment of the Spiritual Supremacy in AD 606 to the Pope's Temporal Sovereignty of 756 AD and to the crowning of the Emperor Charlemagne in 800 AD. To brief my listeners before we begin so near the end of the broadcast, what we're going to see here now is the rise of the Pope's temporal power. We have examined the rise of his spiritual power, his control over the churches. Now we're going to see his rise to power over the governments of the world. So that the Pope is now not just Lord of Lords, but King of Kings as well. You cannot claim to be the God of this world unless you have control both of the spiritual lives and the temporal lives of your subjects. And that's what the Pope is advancing to do. To extend all over the world not only his spiritual power, but his temporal power as well. Chapter 1, gradual increase of the papal power, darkness, superstition, and ignorance of this period. Subsection 1, beginning at the top of page 133 if you're having trouble finding the location. He says that part of the above-named period extending from the establishment of the papal supremacy, that is the spiritual supremacy in 606 A.D., to the epoch of the Pope's temporal sovereignty in 756 A.D., possesses peculiar interest to the student of history. These two dates are those upon which writers on the prophecies relative to popery, that's right, the Bible prophesies the papacy. He says these two dates are those upon which the writers on the prophecies related to popery have been chiefly divided as to the proper commencement of its existence as the little horn of Daniel. Okay? So what the author has just told you is that Daniel spoke of the papacy. Daniel's little horn of chapter 7 and verse 8 is the papacy. Daniel foresaw the rise of this papacy. He called it the little horn. Paul called it that wicked. Okay? Other places, the man of sin, the son of perdition. They all saw the same vision. God warned his people ahead of time. The Scripture speaks of the papacy and only the papacy to fill this role. God prophesies, history reveals. When God prophesies through one of his prophets the rise of the man of sin, you can better believe history will record its fulfillment. And never has history been so minutely fulfilled in the man of sin as in the papacy. It's inarguable. It's incontestable. It's the truth, the Protestant truth. We can believe it and trust it. And therefore we can have no part in the ecumenical movement to return to Rome.